Hi, thanks for joining us for today's webinar, Top 10 Worst Patch Management Practices with Action1. Thanks to Action1 for supporting the ANME with this webinar. Before we get going, I just need to let you know that there's no chat. The Q&A is up at the top. Pop your questions in there anytime. It'll be monitored in the background or addressed at the end of the webinar. The recording and the slide deck will be available tomorrow on the portal. And I'll email everyone that's registered once they're live. That's all from me. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Sean and Drew from Action1. Thanks. Hello, Drew and Sean.
Hi, good afternoon to everybody. First of all, thank you very much for your time and joining the webinar. Rick, thank you very much for organising this. I guess today the webinar is going to be very much about kind of the top 10 worst patch management practices and enabling you to really master patch management to enable secure educational organisations. My name's Drew. I am UK based and I'm an account executive here in the UK, and I'll be really helping manage any kind of questions that you have throughout today, and moving forward, I'd be your best point of contact alongside Sean.
Yep, it's great to be here with everybody. Just like Drew said, we're going to be going over the top 10 worst patch management practices, as well as how those are going to kind of adhere to Cyber Essentials requirements in the UK as well. Before we get started, though, we're going to just quickly make one announcement. Drew, if you want to take this one, and then we can dive into our agenda after this.
Yeah, absolutely. So look, before we do dive into today's agenda, I just want to take a moment to say thank you very much with regards to sending in some questions prior to today's webinar. Thank you very much also for participating. We have actually selected a few questions prior to today's webinar that we're going to be trying to address throughout the webinar. But as well as that, for one lucky person, we will randomly select a winner based on those questions that we found in terms of what was the most intriguing question, and we'll be sending over a £25 Amazon voucher to yourself. Now, I guess while we're talking about prize draws, it'll be very fitting to say that we are also running an additional prize in regards to a post-webinar survey. So please do feel free to fill in that post-webinar survey. Again, one lucky participant will have the chance to win an additional £25 Amazon voucher. Once again, thanks everyone for your participation and engagement, and let's make this webinar an informative and rewarding experience for everyone.
Thanks, Drew. Much appreciated. Okay, let's dive into the agenda for today. First thing we're going to be doing is just talking about the challenges of patch management, going over, how things have kind of changed with the evolution of remote work and remote workplaces, as well as other areas that can just prove to be difficult with patching. And then, of course, as is the name of the webinar, we'll be going over the top 10 worst practices in detail that we see on a regular basis, which will then, of course, be juxtapositions by best practices as well. And then we'll be chatting a little bit about Cyber Essential requirements, of course. This is all going to kind of pertain to that general requirement list. And then we'll have a quick real-world success story, and then we're going to dive into Action1 itself and go over any Q&As that you may have on your end. Now, as we dive into our next slide here, real quick before we get to the direct challenges, we always like to just kind of talk about, what is the current cybercrime statistics in the educational sector. As we can see, in general on these slides, in 2023, an alarming 80% of lower education providers and 79% of higher education providers did fall victim to ransomware attacks in some way, shape, or form. In case anybody's not aware, ransomware in general is going to be encrypting the data and demanding a ransom for its release, usually in the form of Bitcoin or some other cryptocurrency. 40% of those ransomware attacks, though, excuse me, on higher education were due to vulnerability exploitations. Which is really kind of where patching is going to truly come into play, right? When vendors release patches for their software, it's going to be for two reasons. It's going to be to patch features or add new features into the software itself, but primarily, since the majority of updates we see are security related, it's just to patch vulnerabilities. So just by making sure we are staying on top of our patching, we can ideally take that 40% number and dramatically cut that down. And then on top of that, if we kind of look for things outside of the vulnerability scope, 37% of ransomware attacks on higher education institutions occurred due to compromised credentials. Cyber criminals were able to gain access to those systems using stolen username and passwords. And then on top of that, 19% of cyber attacks were initiated through phishing emails. So always kind of leading some credence to the need to be doing phishing testing against the employees within your environment. So again, just some general statistics to kind of remind everybody of the persistent and evolving threats that just any institution, let alone education, faces on a regular basis due to cyber crime. And of course, patching is going to help mitigate a fair amount of this. But before we get into that, we want to talk about the challenges that come along with performing patches. We have three main challenges that we see across patch management. We're going to see things around work environment complexity, operational challenges, and resource and policy constraints. And if we kind of break those three down into different segments and kind of drill down to a little bit more into each one, work environment complexity. This one has definitely changed quite dramatically recently, right? With the advent of more remote-based work, remote-based students, remote learning environments, things like that have become much more commonplace than they were in the past. And a lot of legacy tools out there that assist with patch management were very much so geared with how things were set up previously, where most things were on-premise, remote employees were not nearly as common, and as such, tools weren't really geared to be able to target those systems. And then just kind of a spoiler, Action1 is cloud-based, so we are going to be trying to be able to target those quite easily. Another thing that we see as well is overlooking updates for third-party applications. A lot of focus is put into play around Windows updates, whereas sometimes third-party apps can be forgotten about, or only certain third-party apps are prioritized and others are kind of left to the wayside, which over time builds up vulnerabilities. We also need to consider operational challenges that could occur as well. Every environment's different, and a lot of the things that we need to weigh out are just going to be downtime, patching frequency. Depending on the nature of the environment, we may only be able to patch once a month. Some environments are lucky, they can patch every weekend. Not every environment's the same, so we need to identify what our windows are and what kind of patch frequency we can put into play here. Now, of course, there's also going to be the lack of real-time visibility and just general compatibility issues as well. If we are only looking for updates, say, on a monthly basis and not having a real-time breakdown of where things sit in our environment, there could be vulnerabilities just sitting around for weeks and weeks and weeks that we're not aware of. And then without a way to also properly test our updates, we can run into compatibility issues as well. And then finally, we want to kind of just talk about resource and policy constraints as well. In general, this can be coming down to just general skill shortages or shortages in regards to employee count to be able to manage these types of tasks. That's where automation can really come into play. We also want to make sure that we strike a balance between just general compliance structures as well in regards to data security regulations and also ensuring minimum service interruption. It's definitely a delicate balance to find. And then finally, without any kind of automated testing, this can definitely slow down the patching process. So we want to make sure we have some way to incorporate that into our patching process. But without further ado, let's start talking about the top 10 worst patch management practices that we see on a regular basis. Number one, without a doubt, is going to be failure to prioritize critical patches. I work with a lot of different environments on a very regular basis, and a lot of times critical patches get pushed to the wayside for far longer than they should be. You can kind of break this down in a way, like imagine you have your home, you leave your front door unlocked, and you're kind of basically letting anybody come in. That's really what it's going to kind of come down to if you leave critical patches on the table and we don't get those patches as soon as possible. A lot of environments, I see these critical patches pushed out for 7 days, 14 days, maybe a month. And again, we're basically leaving that front door open, asking somebody to come in and make use of that critical vulnerability to then gain access to our data and cause issues in our environment. So if we can, we want to be establishing effective patch prioritization strategies so we can make sure that these critical patches are being pushed out as quickly as possible. We want to be minimizing the amount of time that it takes for these patches to be put onto our systems. And one of the best ways you can do that is just having clear processes and procedures to make sure that you can evaluate over time how you can be faster and faster about pushing these patches out and getting them in place. The next piece that we look at here in terms of the top 10 worst patch management practices is going to be not testing patches before deployment. If we can help it, we don't want production to be our test environment as much as we can, because what we're going to run into, of course, is unforeseen issues and disruptions in regards to our systems and applications. Without testing these applications, we have no way of knowing how they are going to impact environment. There could be issues where you push out a patch to a critical server in your infrastructure, and all of a sudden that server upon reboot doesn't come back up, and that could be due to a patch. And by testing, we should be able to ideally, with confidence, mitigate a lot of the downtime and potential performance degradation that comes into play here. And that again really is key. We don't want to have things going down while we're trying to fix things through patching. Now, of course, the best things we can do to fix this is to create a test environment in some way. Now, this can come in many shapes and sizes. We could literally create a test environment, right? We could maybe take a copy of some of our critical systems, spin them up on a separate host, and then test updates on them before we deploy out to actual production systems. That's one example. In a more potentially workstation-oriented solution, you could say set aside maybe 20 systems or so that are going to be for more tech-savvy users that you could use them as a test environment before deploying out to the rest of your workstations. And the ultimate goal, of course, as we said, is to really just assess the impact that these patches have on the system. The great thing about workstation patching, when you have tech-savvy users, they are going to usually notice these issues quickly, and they're going to actually be able to communicate with you, what needs to be done or what problem this patch caused. We definitely want to use them as an asset when we're doing that patching piece. But again, the idea is we want to test, identify problems, and then we can mitigate them as we move forward and push into production. Okay, number 3, delayed patch management. Just a couple statistics we always like to throw out here in regards to this. 50% of breach results were from known vulnerabilities in the past year in regards to the ones that did pop up. 40% of organizations take over a month to address known vulnerabilities, and 24% of them require more than 3 months. And really what these statistics show is that, the longer you wait to do your patches, the more likely these vulnerabilities are going to be used against you. And there's some pretty famous examples of this being the case as well. The WannaCry ransomware attack, which occurred back in 2017, targeted unpatched systems worldwide. It used the vulnerability known as Eternal Blue. Microsoft had actually released a patch for it a month before the attack. It's just a lot of organizations failed to apply the critical patch in a timely manner. And because of this, they became victims of ransomware. And of course, all the bad things that come along with that, production disruptions, data loss, financial impact from having to actually pay the ransom. So we really want to make sure that we are trying to minimize how much time it takes for us to push out our updates. And the way we can do this is just through regular patch management assessments. In fact, one thing we recommend as a tool for this is using a patch management policy where you essentially document the process and procedure that you use in your patching process. This is going to include things like who's in charge of the actual patching, who's in charge of identifying patches that need to be pushed, who's in charge of testing. Are we tying in stakeholders so they're aware these patches are going to be pushed and that reboot windows are in place? And once we have a consistent policy in place, we can basically take a look back after each patch run and ask ourselves, okay, how can we do it better? How can we do it faster? Which can really help minimize how much we are delaying the patches that we're pushing out. Of course, automation is going to be a huge asset in this particular area, because if you're trying to do all these patches manually, we're going to talk more on that later, it's going to take a large amount of time. So we want to reduce manual effort as much as possible. And then, of course, we want to make sure we're staying updated on security advisories and vendor releases. By being aware of what is out there, we can easily assess the criticality of particular patches and make sure we push them to the front of the queue. Covering things that are coming from Patch Tuesday and third-party updates. It's just always good to be informed to make sure that we're not missing out on any important patches that should really be pushed out as quickly as possible. Hey, number 4 here. So inefficient communication and coordination. This is one that people might not think about a lot, but it really comes into play because it really just kind of hits at the core of what can be human error in a lot of situations. We want to be establishing cross-functional collaboration. We want to define clear roles. We want to conduct regular meetings and checkpoints. And again, this comes back to the idea of what we just talked about, which is the idea of a patch management policy, where you have consistent roles that are established. You understand what responsibilities are. You are checking in with team members to make sure things are being applied correctly. In education, unique challenges are often going to rise. For example, during extended breaks, when teachers are away, remote management and patching devices is going to become essential. In real life situations, one of our customers from the education sector, happened to face a challenge where they aren't able to apply patches to Windows devices using on-premise tools like SCCM. This led to the need for time-consuming troubleshooting. So when you can't reach them, of course, you got to take a step back and evaluate how you can do so. And to really kind of help mitigate the security risks and improve IT productivity and streamline remote IT support, you want to be, assessing what you can do to improve communication and coordination to make sure that these things aren't an issue. In fact, I can think of, there was a big data breach here in the US. One of our credit union or big credit score companies ended up being breached due to a lack of communication. One team member said, hey, let's go in and patch the system. Didn't get sent over to the other team member and ended up being a breach that affected, millions of Americans. So we want to make sure that we are, staying on top of these things and communicating appropriately. Okay, we've already talked about this a little bit, but I just want to kind of hammer this home one more time, is the lack of patch management policies and procedures. Again, through the use of patch management policy and procedures, we're going to create consistency, clarity, and adherence to best practices. Again, we are establishing guidance for everyone involved among our IT teams and stakeholders, and we're just increasing the efficiency and effectiveness of their patching. Again, by having these pieces documented, understanding who is in charge of what areas of what processes, we're going to be able to better understand, where we can make improvements. We're going to be able to take a step back and ask ourselves, what can we do to cut down time for testing? What can we do to cut down time for deployment? How can we make sure that all these patches are being evaluated quick and efficiently? These are all pieces that we want to be, definitely keeping an eye on as we move forward. Okay, number 4, inadequate patch inventory and tracking. This is one that provides a significant challenge across the board for any type of environment, especially maintaining a secure one. Accurately identifying and tracking systems, applications, their corresponding patch levels, it becomes complex. It becomes a lot, especially as you start to manage more and more systems. The problem just kind of balloons and balloons and balloons in terms of how you can accurately track these pieces. Now, to address these challenges, we want to have some kind of comprehensive tracking mechanism for your patch inventory, and not just patch inventory as well. It's going to be the software that are on those systems, the hardware that you have in place, because those all kind of tie back into the idea of patching, right? The software we have on our systems needs to be patched, the hardware needs to be patched via drivers and firmware updates. All those things are going to come into play. So we want to be using, ideally, automated scanning tools and vulnerability management solutions to make sure that our assets are maintaining an up-to-date status and we have an accurate patch inventory. The idea is, these tools are going to scan your network. They're going to identify systems and applications and provide detailed information about their patch status, so you can make use of these tools to save time and ensure your patch management inventory remains current. And the idea behind these tools as well is that it's going to be, a real-time breakdown, so you can see the information around what kind of patches you're missing, vulnerabilities. Again, we don't want to be going weeks and weeks and weeks without being able to see where our environment currently sits. We want a complete picture of our assets as much as possible, so we can apply patches uniformly across the entire environment. Okay, this is a big one that we see, a fair bit, unfortunately. And it just comes down to a matter of, how much time and resource you have in play, but it's going to be ignoring end-of-life software and unsupported systems. This undoubtedly is going to expose your organization to significant risks. When you are running end-of-life software, you're going to be missing out on critical security updates, patches. You're not going to have vendor support, which just makes you more susceptible to exploits and cyber attacks. This is going to also potentially lead to compliance violations, heightened vulnerabilities in regards to potential security breaches, just general operational inefficiencies as well, where you're going to be potentially missing out on new features that can make you more productive as a whole. When we go back to that WannaCry ransomware attack as well, that was an example of certain instances, say Windows Update, Windows XP, not receiving security updates from Microsoft. Now, what we want to do to try to mitigate this, of course, is to put in play proper strategies, because this is really a matter of, fighting against the clock to an extent, right? We want to be creating an inventory of end-of-life software in unsupported systems. We want to be staying ahead of the game, essentially. We don't want to be waiting until, 1 month out when, a certain OS or software expires to be planning on how to correct and fix these and upgrade. We want to be doing this in a timely manner and make sure that we're giving ourselves plenty of time to get these systems replaced before they go end of life. We don't want to be doing it after they become end of life, of course, because then we become susceptible to all the risks that we've already discussed. We want to be, conducting risk assessments as well, because some systems, of course, are going to be a greater priority than others in terms of which ones we should be pushing effort into in regards to upgrades. If we have a niche server that does a one-off process that isn't really system critical, it's probably not going to get nearly as much effort put into it and time put into it as, say, our domain controller that's going to be going end of life, right? Now that being said, doesn't mean we shouldn't prioritize the other system at one point, but we'd want to be upgrading the more critical systems first and foremost. Now, in some situations with end-of-life software and systems, we can run into instances, though, where we just can't go anywhere else, right? It could be end-of-life in the most literal of terms, where that software is no longer supported, the company is no longer around. In that instance, we want to, again, be making sure we're planning for it, because we need to have migration options in place so we can switch over to alternative solutions to make sure we can still use similar tools for the kind of operations we need. We touched on number 8 here a little bit already, but overlooking third-party patches. Again, we see a lot of emphasis put behind the idea of Patch Tuesday, Windows updates, things like that. And for good reason. There's a reason why we do this, is because a lot of vulnerabilities that are leveraged are on the operating system side of things. But that doesn't mean that we don't see vulnerabilities being leveraged from a third-party patching standpoint as well. Which again goes back to the breach that I discussed earlier. Equifax is the name of the company that was impacted again on the US side, that ended up basically leaking 147 individual sensitive personal information due to a breach vulnerability that was found in Apache struts. So these are kind of pieces that we want to make sure that we're keeping in mind. And things that we often see on the third-party patching side of things is a lot of times things like Chrome, Adobe, Firefox are going to be prioritized, which is great. They should be. They're used in pretty much every environment there is. But if we forget about other third-party patches and we don't have a comprehensive list and breakdown of all the third-party software on our environment, we are not going to be aware of those pieces of software that are installed on a few machines that could be building vulnerabilities over time. And a lot of cyber attacks are going to be targeting the vulnerabilities that are found in third-party software. It really makes them a prime target for exploitation, because they do tend to be forgotten about in some instances. Now, of course, the best way to manage this is by leveraging some kind of patch management tool in some way, shape, or form. Environments as a whole, they're going to be managing hundreds of different third-party applications, and having to do that manually and keep track of all the updates and everything else that's involved there is going to be a very time-consuming process to have to do manually. So we want to try to tie in, again, some form of automation to make it so we can take some of that weight off of our shoulders and have time to focus on other areas of concern. Number 9, not monitoring patch compliance and effectiveness. So monitoring patch compliance is going to be really crucial to ensuring the successful application of patches to relevant systems. We want to be able to track and verify patch deployment to maintain a secure and resilient environment. We want to be able to assess, again, the effectiveness of these deployed patches. We can have various tools and techniques at our disposal to do so. One approach, of course, is using vulnerability scanning and penetration testing. These methods are going to help you identify remaining vulnerabilities, right? You don't know what you don't know. So unless you have some sort of insight into the vulnerabilities that exist in your environment, you're just kind of assuming that everything's okay. So we want to take the extra step, do these scans, do the penetration testing, and identify if there's any other vulnerabilities that we should be aware of. It's always good to have extra pairs of eyes, is the idea. We want to then, take the information that we get and, kind of build off that and leverage other reporting monitoring tools as well. These again are going to help us track patch compliance, identify any gaps or discrepancies, take corrective actions as needed. We want to, again, have visibility in the compliance of our systems. We can address non-compliant areas promptly and just make sure we have a very strong security posture. So we want to be, again, just to summarize, doing general reviews as to where we sit in our environment by checking the patch compliance and effectiveness within our organization. And then number 10, I would say this is probably the biggest one that we will run into that is obviously not going to be very effective at all, which is manual patching. Of course, there can be one-off instances where we need to do it because we need to have a guiding hand involved, but there's many reasons why this is one of the worst practices. Human error is going to come into play, right? Requires human intervention. This makes it prone to errors, unfortunately. Mistakes are going to occur. during the patch identification process, the download process, installation, all those pieces can have an error that can occur in some way, shape, or form. And then by this process generally being inconsistent, we're going to lead to systems that are just not patched, which means they have more vulnerabilities in play, which expose your systems to security risks. Number two, and in my opinion, this is the biggest one, it's just very time consuming. As you begin to scale your environment, you start working with hundreds of thousands of systems. Having to patch these manually is going to take a tremendous amount of time. It's going to mean we're going to have to search for the patches, which is going to cover, again, not just Windows updates, but third-party applications. So you'd have to go into Windows updates, grab the needed patches, then look for every third-party patch that's available for every piece of software in your environment, download them, and then apply them to each system individually. And this is a process you have to repeat on an individual system basis in most instances, because they're going to all have different pieces of software you need to patch on top of that. It really just becomes an incredibly time-consuming process if you do not have it automated in some way. Of course, lack of scalability really correlates very directly with the just general time-consumingness of manual patching. You're not going to be able to scale this properly. We're only one person or maybe a team of people. And as such, once we start, again, working with large numbers of systems, we're going to start overlooking things. We're going to miss critical patches, things like that. Limited visibility. We've talked about this already. We want to have visibility into our environment. If we're doing it manually, again, we're not going to be able to see everything in a centralized manner. We're going to basically be going to system, looking at it, saying, okay, that looks good enough, and then moving on. And chances are we probably missed something. Compliance and audit concerns. So if you are trying to provide information as a whole about your systems and to showcase where they sit from a compliance standpoint, not having any kind of automated reporting is going to be a big hindrance there. It's going to become, I would argue, next to impossible to gather all the data you need to be able to prove that you're actually adhering to the compliance standards that you say you are. And then, of course, delayed threats to responses and threats, delayed responses to threats, apologies, is going to come into play as well. The first thing we talked about was delaying critical patches. There's no easier way to delay your patching than by doing it manually. It's going to, again, take more time. You're going to be weeks, if not months, out of date in regards to the patches that are being pushed through. And all that while, those vulnerabilities are just sitting there waiting to be exploited in some way, shape, or form by threat actors. Okay, so what we'll talk about next is just the general patch management process in 10 steps. So we've kind of gone over 10 practices that we should avoid. So then what is the overall kind of guiding through line we want to make sure we're doing when we are patching in general? First, we want to be creating a patch management policy. We've talked about this a fair bit already. We want to have a documented process and procedure that shows how our patch management process is going to flow. Again, we want to know what teams are in charge of what processes, who's going to be doing what on what day, who's being made aware of these changes. We want to document that so we have consistency in our process. From there, we want to inventory our IT assets. Ideally, this is to be done in an automated fashion. Again, we don't want to be doing this manually. That would be incredibly time consuming. And once we have an inventory of our IT assets, we can identify easily what systems we need to be most concerned about, what kind of patches are pending, and then we can do risk level prioritization, as we can see with step 3 here, to assess that and ask ourselves, what kind of systems are we going to then prioritize based off either the value of the system itself, the criticality of the vulnerability, and things like that. We can put those into consideration and then prioritize our efforts accordingly. From there, we want to be monitoring for updates in general. Again, we want this to be an automated fashion. We don't want to be looking and trying to receive vendor releases, manually or anything along those lines. We want to have some way to get that information brought into us automatically so we know what patches we need to push out to our systems. From there, we want to leverage automation every step of the way to be able to not only test our patches, apply our patches, report on compliances, every bit they're going to basically identify and automate every step of the way that we can. Then, of course, there are going to be instances where we need to make patch exceptions. Not a super common practice if we can help it, but it does occur where things like compatibility issues do arise. So if we need to make exceptions, we should do so, but we should also pair that with checking with the vendor in question and identifying what kind of workarounds they have in play with this. Not just excluding the patch and saying that's fine, we'll come back to it, but we should be working with the vendor to identify any kind of mitigation steps they have for the vulnerability that this patch is supposed to fix. Number 7, of course, is going to be testing the patches before we push out. We want to be, again, having a test environment in play that we are using automation, to then roll out to those test systems to make sure that these patches are working as we expect, that they're not going to cause issues. Now, of course, our test environment, we can try to get as close as possible to production, but we still want to be prepared in the instance that our testing was not 100% accurate, and that preparation is going to come in the form of creating backups. By creating backups, we can essentially, make sure we have a fallback plan in the event that something happens during our update window. Sometimes patches can go through and completely brick systems and cause plenty of issues. Let's make sure we have a way to fall back on those backups. And of course, the only good backup is a tested backup. So that's a different tangential point, but make sure you're testing your backups. Otherwise, it's potentially not going to work. Then we want to apply the patch as quick as possible, of course. That's what we're going to use automation for as well. And then from there, once our patching is complete, we want to document the results. And, ideally, we're automating a lot of this documentation in terms of, did things succeed? Did we have problems? So on and so forth. But we also want to make a point of documenting any, outlier issues, any things of note. Was there a special process or procedure that came up with this particular patch that we pushed out? We want to try to document all these. So that way, the next time we do this process, it's not a surprise where we have documentation. We know the steps. Somebody else can step in and assist. So we want to make sure, again, documentation is heavily being leveraged. Okay, the next thing we want to talk about then is going to be in general using Cyber Essentials as a part of everything that we just discussed. As you all know, Cyber Essentials is going to be the cybersecurity certification program recognized by the UK government. It's going to provide a framework and guidelines to help organizations, including educational institutions, safeguard their digital environments against common cyber threats. It's got 5 core areas for cybersecurity, of course: firewall configurations, secure configurations, user access control, malware protection, and the big theme of today, of course, being patch management. So as you can see, Cyber Essentials encourages organizations to maintain up-to-date systems and software by regularly applying patches. And in doing so, we want to avoid the top 10 instances that we and ideally, by following these Cyber Essential guidelines, you can mitigate common cybersecurity risks. Including the risk, this is ideally going to reduce the risk of data breaches, unauthorized access, and just general disruptions caused by unpatched vulnerabilities and systems. Now, before we move on to the next slide, I just want to just double check, Drew, do you have anything you want to add on this slide? Okay, we'll keep moving forward. We want to then discuss a just real world success story on our end, that a customer that was able to use Woodland, or was able to use Action1 to patch their systems in a successful manner. We have a particular school district here, Woodland Hills School District. They have about approximately 3,500 students that they work with on a yearly basis. And the IT team there had 4 team members responsible for managing endpoints of around 400 staff members and thousands of different students. The team was using SCCM to manage Windows updates, but it did not work for third-party applications as they would like to. When you use SCCM for third-party patches, it's a lot of manual packaging. In 2020, the school was hit with ransomware, which caused a ton of damage, unfortunately. Furthermore, during the summer period, when the teachers were away for 3 months and took their devices home, they couldn't patch the Windows devices with SCCM either, as it's more or less a strictly an on-premise tool. Additionally, if the teachers needed troubleshooting, they had to physically drive a location, which took up to 40 minutes to an hour of time. All in all, not a great situation to be in there. To address these challenges, they implemented Action1 as their automated patch management solution. With Action1, the team was able to automate the deployment of third-party applications and enhance their security posture. They established patching policies that align with the organization's needs. And in the case of offsite devices, Action1 was able to target those because Action1 was a cloud-based patching solution. And they were able to then use Action1 to deploy out OS and third-party patches with Action1. As a result, thanks to Action1, they were able to get all the security updates installed on time, and their entire environment from an IT standpoint is just much better protected from threats like ransomware. So ideally, this doesn't happen again like it did in 2020 for them. Also, just as another little added bonus, through Action1's built-in remote desktop feature, the team can also provide IT support to their workers no matter where they're located. So no more having to go to the physical location. They can just remote into the system, work with the end user directly, and resolve any issues that may be coming up. Now we're getting close to wrapping up our presentation here. One thing we do want to point out for everybody is, Action1 is free for the first 100 endpoints. Basically, that means free patch management. You're gonna be able to automate remediations for OS and third-party applications. This is not a free trial. There's no feature limits. 100 endpoints never expires. So, if you're below that 100 point mark, give Action1 a try. See how it works. See how you're able to increase the automation within your environment to make sure your environment is secure. We have, again, built-in enrollment access and endpoint management features as well on top of the patching piece. You can also deploy software out. You can get in-depth reporting. You can scan for vulnerabilities. All these things are included in Action1. Again, for free for the first 100 endpoints. And in terms of support, that is one difference on the free 100 endpoints is that is going to be community-based support for the free version. If you wanted to have direct support with the Action1 staff, that's going to be more on the licensing side of things. But you are able to join our Discord. It's a very healthy community. We have plenty of people on there conversing every day, system administrators from all over the world, basically sharing best practices and policies that they use in their environment. Okay. And then just as a side note, we do have special pricing for the education sector. For more details, you can contact the Action1 team by using the QR code listed here, or once you receive a copy of the slides, you can click on the link there as well to see that information listed there. I'll leave this up for just 30 seconds in case anybody wants to scan that QR code. Okay, we'll move on to the next slide here. Okay, and then again, we have our prize draw. Just as a reminder, we have a post-webinar survey. If you were able to share your feedback, that'd be greatly appreciated, and it will put you in the running for a 25-pound Amazon voucher. So if you want to, fill out that survey, you potentially could win that voucher, which would be great. We would greatly appreciate it as well, because that feedback lets us know how we are doing in regards to these presentations, the webinars themselves, the content we're providing. It lets us know how we should just steer these presentations moving forward. Okay, let's do a quick Q&A session right here in regards to just some common questions that we get, and then we're going to dive into the demo portion of Action1. Within that demo section, feel free to put any questions you have into the Q&A area as well, and we'll get to those after the demo. But some common QAs that we see as well. One question: how does your solution deal with bandwidth issues of maintaining compliance across a large fleet of devices during business hours, when bandwidth should be used for production/main school activities? This is a very common question we get, not just in the context of education, but really any environment that has bandwidth issues. One thing Action1 does that's quite unique is we will make use of peer-to-peer file sharing. Again, Action1 is cloud-based, so of course we have updates coming in from the internet. And one way we mitigate that bandwidth, again, is through the peer-to-peer file sharing aspect. So let's say we have, 300 systems in an environment, and we are, pushing out the latest version of Google Chrome. If there was no peer-to-peer aspect to the download process, we have to download Google Chrome individually to each system for 300 unique downloads. The peer-to-peer component of Action1 is instead going to download that application one time and then share it out locally across the LAN. The Action1 agents that you download on the systems essentially communicate amongst each other fully automatically, and will share those files as needed. And on top of that, once the files are shared amongst the endpoints, they will also be cached on each endpoint for around 15 days, basically creating like a decentralized cache, where if other endpoints at any point in time need that update file, they're going to be able to reach out to other endpoints on the local LAN and get that update file as needed, rather than going out to the internet to retrieve that file. So we can really cut down on bandwidth quite dramatically. How do organizations balance timely patch management for security while minimizing disruptions to critical systems and managing costs amongst tight budgets? So on the first portion there, this is going to definitely vary a little bit, but automation is really the name of the game when it comes to being able to minimize disruptions. If we can, through automation, schedule updates to occur in the middle of the night at, say, 1 a.m., 2 a.m., that in of itself is going to greatly minimize disruptions, especially in the education sector, where in general, we shouldn't have to be worried about anybody needing the systems that late at night, right? So something like that could be a great example of that. In terms of the tight budgets and things like that, Action1, again, we are not just offering patching, we're going to offer remote access, we're going to offer reporting, we're going to offer vulnerabilities scanning as well. And all that is part of the Action1 console. So you're getting all these various tools in one cohesive package, basically making it so that you can kind of have just a one single tool to go to for all your various needs that maybe from an IT standpoint. Okay, on average, another question, how much time do people typically postpone updates for? So this one, again, it varies. The guidance that we give, as we discussed in the presentation today, is we want to minimize that as much as possible. What I have seen customers do, though, is they will say have a test group that they push out to, and they have no postpone time at all, because that's a test group. They should be getting their updates as quick as possible. And they will have this test group ideally be querying for updates every single day. So that way, when a new update comes out, it should be getting it the same day that they're in place. So that way they can, identify how those patches impact their environment. From there, they might break it up into a couple different ways. They might have their test group and then a main production. And then that might have like maybe a 3-day window, a 7-day window. Again, ideally, it's as close to 0 as possible, but this is something I've seen other customers do. Or they might have multiple patching rollout windows. They might have, test and then patching group A, B, C, D. And then A might get the updates 1 day after. B might get the updates 2 days after. C, 3 days after, and so on and so forth. So that way, kind of a rolling deployment. So that way, again, if something goes wrong with the patching process and patches cause issues, it's not going to impact the entire environment. So that's another way you can handle that. Another question we did receive as well is, our users are always very busy, and although you can schedule updates, we struggle to get those updates as users don't restart. What methods are included in your offering to help solve the issue of users ignoring messages to restart? Great question. We're going to actually demonstrate this in the demo, which we're going to be proceeding to here in just a moment. But trust that we have a very comprehensive restart function within Action1 for the patching process. When patches are pushed out, the end user will be prompted to restart their system. But they have two options. They can restart now, or they can snooze it based off a time frame you provide. And we're going to actually dive into that more in the demo. I'd much rather just showcase that piece to show how that function works. And with that being said, let's switch over to our demo environment. Give me just one moment while I get that pulled up. In the meantime, again, if you have any questions, feel free to put those into the Q&A section within Teams. And if you want to sign up for Action1, just as things right now, you can scan the QR code. Again, 100 endpoints are free. I will leave these up for just a few moments while I pull up my demo environment.
Hey, Sean, we've got a question. In terms of, it's a fantastic question, actually. What is the best day in the week to run Windows updates if you were aiming for weekly patches? So the customer here has said, I've seen arguments for Mondays before Patch Tuesday or Patch Tuesday itself. What would you recommend?
I think it's going to really come down to how you go about the deployment of your updates from are you doing testing? Are you doing a phase approach? So on and so forth. So regardless of what way you go about it, I think the best thing to do is to have some sort of test group in place, and those patches are being pushed out the day they release on Patch Tuesday. So that way you can get a leg up on the testing process. You can see how that's being rolled out, and that way you can really assess, okay, here's the impact it has on my environment in some way, shape, or form. So that'd be testing on workstations and servers if possible. So that way you can just get, again, a very quick jump on where things are at, on how those updates are going to impact your environment. From there, you're going to have to kind of do a little bit of kind of inspection how your environment is structured, right? Because it's going to vary from environment to an extent. But ideally, you're going to be getting those pushed out as quick as possible. So you do testing on Patch Tuesday on the day they're released. And then for the rest of your systems, maybe you want to give your patches, a couple days or a day or so to be in the testing process where end users are actually using the system, potentially finding issues. From there, you're just going to want to plan accordingly into what's going to give the least disruption, right? If you're able to install updates at the end of the day on Friday, that's great. If you can do end of day, on Thursday, even better, because you're going to get it out faster and faster. Weekends are going to be tough, of course, especially in the EDU environment, because pretty much everybody's gone, right? So I would recommend, ideally, you want to get everything done within that initial week when Patch Tuesday is pushed out. If you can, a Thursday or Friday push for everything else would be preferred if possible, with testing being done on Patch Tuesday itself. Any other questions, Drew, before we dive into the demo?
No, no more questions at this stage. I would urge the audience, please do feel free to ask questions. I am in the background monitoring. I'm more than happy to try and answer those for you digitally as well.
Fantastic. Well, let's dive into the Action1 environment here. We're going to give a quick demonstration about Action1 functions from a patching standpoint. And then again, if any questions come through, we can certainly address those as they pop up. So here we are at Action1. Action1, again, is a cloud-based solution. Just to clarify, in terms of getting Action1 actually in play, you will need to install the Action1 agent. So we can see here, we want to download the Action1 agent. This is an MSI installer. Once Action1 is installed in your systems, you'll then be able to manage it through the endpoint section right here. Now, in regards to ways I've seen users deploy Action1 out at scale, they will use it potentially as a GPO deployment. There's one way, through a software deployment GPO. They might already have some kind of deployment tool in place in their environment, which is a great solution to be able to push out the Action1 agent. Or if they choose to, they can use our deployer as well. We have comprehensive documentation on how to configure this in our documentation page on our website. But in general, this is going to work by setting up the deployer, and then you essentially point to a domain or OU that contains computer objects in your environment. And then Action1 every 30 minutes is going to query the objects that you are pointed to and push out the agent. So that way they're going to be deployed out automatically as new systems come in, which just makes that process far more painless than doing it manually. But if we take a look at our endpoints here, I do want to be aware of the time. We have about 15 minutes left, I do believe. We want to make sure that we kind of go over the patching process and how that works within the confines of Action1. So when we click on an endpoint here, we can see a variety of information, right? We can see that we can do reboots. We can run scripts through Action1. We can deploy software. Of course, we can deploy updates, which is our main focus here. We can also uninstall software. We can see vulnerabilities that exist on our endpoint. There's a lot of things that Action1 is going to be able to provide and give you insight into. But the biggest piece, of course, and the theme of today's webinar is patching. So if we look at the missing updates that are listed here within my console for this endpoint, I can see that I have Windows updates that are pending, and I can also see third-party patches that I am missing within my particular environment and in this system in particular. So again, Action1 is going to be basically showcasing you what patches you need from a Windows update and third-party standpoint. So we're covering all of those different bases. Now, we pride ourselves on being a very simple to use platform to push out these updates. All you need to do is just select these. These updates, by the way, are being queried in real time. You don't need to do any kind of scanning to get this list in place. It's just happening automatically. And then from here, I can say deploy. We will load in these patches. And when we look at the patches that are here, for one-time pushes, we might have to accept some EULAs. We'll ignore those for right now. Essentially, all I have to do though is just say accept. And then we can configure a couple other settings here, such as reboot parameters. One thing again that we had as a question. Just kind of show what this looks like in the console. We can see we can customize a message to send to the end user. So we can put whatever we want in this message prompt so that way they are aware that their computer requires maintenance, needs to be rebooted. And then we can control how much time the end user has until that reboot will occur. If I want to give the end user 3 hours, I can. If I want to be very generous, I can give them 3 days. And essentially what's going to happen is once updates are done being applied to the system, if a reboot is required by the updates, again, only if it's required. If it's not, this message won't pop up. The end user will see the prompt and they'll be given the option to either reboot now, or they'll be told your computer's going to reboot in, say, 3 days. Do you want to snooze this reminder message for 1 minute, 5 minutes, 8 hours, whatever it may be? And at the end of that snooze period, they'll be shown the same message and reminded that the reboot is going to occur in, let's say we did an 8-hour snooze. It's going to occur in, about 2 hours and 16 minutes, or 2 days and 16 hours, give or take, as an example. Then they can then choose, do I want to reboot now, or do I want to just do this message again? If you're reminded, and so on and so forth. This way they're getting consistent reminders and they're making sure the system is going to reboot and they're aware of that. We also have a checkbox that just turns off automatic Windows updates. This is going to be probably more applicable when we start talking about automating patching. But the idea is we're going to give Action1 control over the update process and just randomly pushing out patches to systems. Just gives us more control there. We can see our endpoint is selected by clicking next, and then we can schedule this task to occur whenever we want. We can run this, right now. We can run it at a specific time. When we start talking about automations, we can also look at the idea of doing reoccurring events, either weekly or monthly. And then the final piece I do want to point out as well is we do have catch-up windows within Action1, heartbeat sensors, some people call them, or just general time to live for the command. And the idea behind this setting right here is, let's say my endpoint is not online. When I send out this command, I can tell Action1 how long I want to keep that command alive for. And essentially, I can say 24 hours, I could say 24 days. And if the computer comes online at any point in time within this time frame that we're specifying here, we're still going to do these updates that are requested. So that way you don't have to worry about, are these computers online or not, or are they, even turned on? Because this catch-up window is going to really kind of act as a catch-all for those systems that just aren't reachable at that specific point in time when you schedule updates to go out. It can really minimize your missed update windows that are being pushed. Now, when we look at these updates, I like to clarify where these are coming from. In regards to Windows updates, we grab these through the Windows Update API. We Microsoft to bring these into play and to showcase what's available on the system. We find it works great. We just go straight to the source, and it honestly makes no sense. For third-party application patches that we offer, we have a built-in repository that's just a part of Action1. And anything marked as built in here, we are going to be essentially maintaining these packages for you and making sure you have the latest version of these apps. We have a full team on the back end. They're going to be identifying, detecting new versions. They're going to be installing these versions to validate upgrade paths and the installs work correctly, and just doing general testing to make sure that when you go to update these, that they're going to work the way you expect. Now, any of the applications you see here, again, we are maintaining. You can also click on these applications. You can see old versions that we have released in the past, and you can even push out old versions if it's required for compatibility reasons. Now you can also click on these and you can learn more about the application itself that we have uploaded. You can see things like release notes. Excuse me. We can see, the installation parameters that are being used here. So if we want to know what kind of parameters are being leveraged, we can do that. And the benefit of Action1 having its own private repository, rather than relying on, say, a public repository like a Chocolatey that some of our other competitors may use, is we can layer in additional steps as a part of these processes to make these applications even more consistent in terms of deployment. So for pretty much every package that Action1 supports, we are doing some kind of pre and post deployment checks to make sure that things are working correctly. In this instance, for Adobe Reader, we're doing a deployment check prior to install to make sure that this is going to push through the way that you would expect. And we're layering in these scripts across a variety of the applications we support, again, just to make sure that things work. One of our things that we say at Action1 is patching. That just works. And this is one of the reasons why that is the case. The other piece I want to repository, just in case you are curious, you can add in your own applications to the repository as well through the use of custom packages. You can add those to the repository by clicking right here. It's a pretty straightforward process. You can maintain versions over time as well, like we saw in the built-in packages. And then this will tie into the missing updates as well. So any package you upload will also be offered as a missing update if it's applicable for your systems. And in terms of installation options here, you can do MSIs or EXEs, and you can upload directly to the Action1, either 32-bit or 64-bit downloads. And we do support up to 32 gigabytes per package that you upload into Action1. And we can just click upload right here and upload either a MSI, EXE, or a full zip archive containing the files that we need. From there, we just put in our install switches, and assuming these are good from this command line preview, we hit save, and it's going to be added in Action1. And this is not just going to be for the purposes of patching. You can also deploy this software out if you want to as well. Might as well showcase that as long as we're on the screen. So if you want to, you can click this software and just deploy to endpoints and do silent deployment across any system you want. Now that we understand, where these updates originate from, how Action was retrieving these updates, and how we can kind of just do simple deployments, let's talk about automating that process. So if we go to automations here, we can create update automations within the console by saying deploy update, and we can choose to either do all patches, we can do matching filters of updates. And what these are is we can very granularly choose what kind of patches we want to push out with this automation. Again, with this automation, we are creating a reoccurring schedule that's going to just ideally take care of these patches automatically. So I could choose something like update source and say this automation is going to cover all of my third-party applications. With just that simple line right there, we're covering everything that we have in the repository. And then we can target that against our systems. But if we want, we could also add in Windows updates. And then maybe we want to exclude updates as well. We can do exclusions. So maybe we don't want to do drivers or upgrades with this particular automation. We might say that for a different automation. So we can do exclusions there as well. Now from there, we can choose to either automatically approve and deploy these updates. So we can basically say, if it matches this filter, deploy them automatically. And you can layer in delays here as well. This is one way I will see users come in and do phased rollouts where they might say my test group is 0 days, but my next patching group is 3 days, my next one is 6 days, 9 days, etc. That's one way to kind of do a phased rollout. And then for maybe server deployments, you could use manual approval, or if you just want more control over what patches are allowed in general. And the manual approval flag right here, if this is set, you can go into update approval on the left-hand side right here, and you can choose what updates you want to approve or decline. And through this, you can very granularly choose, I want this update to go through, I don't want this one to go through. And if you do decline an update, you can always come back in and reapprove it, no problem. But again, this just gives you more control over what is being allowed. Go back into our automation section. We can again configure reboots that will happen automatically. Again, you can custom brand this if you want. And then we have the same checkbox we saw previously that turns off automatic Windows updates. From here, we can choose what systems we want to push out to. We can do all, we can do groups. We can talk about groups in just a moment. And then we can make this a weekly occurrence for this update push. Maybe we run this every single day of the week, for instance, on a set time frame. We could do monthly. Maybe we want to correlate with Patch Tuesday and have this run every second Wednesday of every month. Things like that are all applicable and possible with the automation creation process that we see here. And then we can also configure that same catch-up window that we discussed previously. Now, the idea is these automations are pretty quick and easy to create, thankfully. They're not going to be overly complex to set up. And then the idea would be is you would create multiple automations, right? Different automations for servers, different automations for test runs. Maybe you have one strictly for third-party applications. And you can kind of cater these automations to what you want to see being performed in your environment on an automatic basis. Drew, I just want to check, do we have any other questions that we should be going over? I know we're getting close on the hour mark here.
Yeah, we don't have any other questions. I was just going to ask, with slide number 7, we mentioned about the worst practice around ignoring end-of-life software. Do you want to talk the audience through how we'd be able to help mitigate against kind of having software which they may not necessarily want on their environment?
Of course. So with end-of-life software, we're going to be seeing a few different things. In general, end-of-life software is going to have quite a few vulnerabilities. So we would be able to identify those here within the confines of our vulnerability scanning piece. So Action1 would ideally be catching those vulnerabilities and showcasing them here. So that's one indicator that your software may be getting close to end of life, in case you were not aware. But if you find that software is end of life and you want to just remove it from your environment, we have an installed software view here that will essentially show you every piece of software that's installed across your entire environment, across all endpoints. And you can very easily go in here and just put a checkbox next to the software you want to remove. So if you could find that end-of-life software that you no longer need in your environment, you could just simply select it and say uninstall. And you can do this for multiple applications at once. This is a great way, not even just from an end-of-life standpoint, but it's cleaning up your environment and also just removing old software that you just find is full of vulnerabilities. You can go in and just say, okay, let's just install it. And you can be very specific about the versions of the software you want to remove. I could say all versions, I could say a specific version, I could do versions older than a specific version. I could, go into all versions of this one as well. And I could say next, target all of my systems and very quickly just push this out to every endpoint in my environment and, not have to worry about doing this manually at all. Action will just take care of it completely behind the scenes, silently, not interrupting the end users. And just like that, all that software will be removed from your ecosystem.
Perfect. And again, conscious that we are kind of slightly running late on time. I guess the last piece is very much around the reporting capabilities, tying into what we talked about earlier with regards to cyber essentials and being able to satisfy any auditors from a compliance perspective. The reporting is really helpful around that piece. So if you could very, very quickly show the audience through kind of the reporting capabilities with regards to patching, but outside of that as well.
Of course. So we have a selection of built-in reports here. We can cover things like IT asset management, security, configuration information. In the confines of what we discussed today, though, patch management reports are going to be first and foremost. When we look at the reports that are available within Action1 from an update standpoint, we can very easily generate an entire breakdown of every single update run that's ever occurred via this Windows Update History report, for example. This could very easily just be exported via the tools section here via CSV or HTML, and it could be handed over and basically say, hey, we have a full record of every single update that was performed, the status, did it succeed, did it fail, and where all of those pieces sit. So that way you have just an entire historical breakdown. And for these type of reports as well, if you want, you can clone these and change the data layout as well. You're not stuck to this data layout where it's broken down by, say, per update views. You could break this down on a per endpoint basis and really kind of show things by a certain date frame, things like that. You can really match and control through this clone function any kind of data layout that you may desire that may be applicable for the particular audit or compliance you're trying to meet. As we can see here, I can very easily basically come in, I could rearrange columns as needed, move things up and down. I could go over to a simple report and I can basically rearrange this from now a drill down, but something I can just essentially select all these columns on and organize by endpoint name. I can say next and just hit finish, and this will generate a brand new report that will showcase again every single update that went through. Did it fail? Did it succeed? Was it aborted for some reason? What was the error code? All that data is right here, just in general. If I want, I can also see full breakdowns of just a weekly standpoint. What was ran within the last 7 days? I can see third-party applications listed here, updates that are missing, on how many endpoints. I can click here and identify what those systems are, and I can very easily see, here's my endpoint. It does not have that version of Adobe Reader, so I should look into that. I can also go back here and see what was deployed. I can see 4 systems did get the latest version of Firefox, and so on and so forth. And there's plenty of other reports here that you can work with. Again, you can export all of these to CSV. You can even go in and you can subscribe to these as well and just have them sent to your email automatically. So that way you have to come into the portal to look at those. Tons of options for grabbing data within the console. Any final pieces we want to highlight, Drew?
Perfect. No, I think in terms of next steps to the audience here, I'd really recommend signing up for the free account. Like Sean mentioned earlier, it is fully featured. First 100 endpoints are free. We find that it proves really useful for our customers from an evaluation and testing perspective, just to make sure that the Action1 platform is effectively doing what we say it's going to do. And I think moving forward from there, we'd be very happy to engage individuals or organizations specifically if you'd like a one-to-one demo, or if you've got any pressing questions and you'd like to kind of get on a call with us and go through those, we'd be more than happy to do so. I guess final remarks from myself. I just want to say thank you very much for all of your time today, Rick. And the ANME team, thank you very much for organizing. Sean, any final comments from you?
I think I'm good. Again, I echo the same words. Thank you very much for everybody that's attended. Thank you for the ANME team. It's been a pleasure, and we hope to do it again.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Magic. Thank you very much, Sean and Drew. We will share the recording. It'll be available on the portal and on the main website. We'll share the slide deck, which will be on the portal on the event page, and you'll get a notification when that's been added. I'm assuming your contact details will be in that follow-up information as well. Will be in the QR codes in the presentation. Yeah, magic. Thank you very much. The feedback survey is live on the portal now, so please do complete that and share as much information as you can. It's really helpful, and there's obviously the draw for the £25 Amazon voucher with that as well. Cool. So thank you very much all.